the Raiders got off to a pretty bad start in 2023 because of poor quarterback play, as expected, from Jimmy Garbage Fail, aka Jimmy Garoppolo, and poor coaching from Josh McDaniels, which resulted in the benching of the former and the firing of the latter mid-season. So once both of those happened, once they did that after week 8, they enjoyed a much better second half, thanks to a very strong defense and a much better coaching effort from their interim head coach, Antonio Pierce, as they finished a second half of the season at 5-4. So sure, they didn't make the playoffs again, but at 8-9, they showed a little bit of promise for what was to come this coming season. So that being said, there are some things to figure out. There's some things to sort as you are going to potentially bring on the coach that really worked out for you in the second half of 2023. That being said, looking at some of their key offseason events, well, they promoted the guy that really helped them get to that good record in the second half of the year. They promoted Antonio Pierce as as the full-time head coach. Mark Davis making the right choice there, but they also had to replace the general manager Dave Ziegler because, well, when Josh McDaniels went, Ziegler also left with his bad decisions. So Ziegler was replaced by former Chargers general manager Tom Telesco, which was kind of a questionable decision considering that Telesco, he was also a part of that, ironically, that 70-point fiasco on the other side of it with the Chargers. But now that he's with the Raiders, it'll be interesting how that turned out. They also released Jimmy Garoppolo and also receiver Hunter Renfrow. And it's kind of sucks with Renfrow because he had those couple 2 years from 2020 to 2021 with the Raiders, but then he fell off mainly because of injury, which is unfortunate for the guy. So looking at some of the moves in free agency and the draft with this team, so they kind of dealt a big blow at the running back spot with Josh Jacobs. So Jacobs unfortunately decided not to stay with the team. He's moving on to the Packers. So there was a big hole with the running back spot. So that's a little bit unfortunate there. But they also lost a couple of reserve guys like Bilal Nichols to Arizona, and on the offensive side of the ball, Jermaine Elmore to the Giants. But they try to make up for it in both free agency and the draft by getting a key piece of the defensive line in Christian Wilkins from the Dolphins, their top defensive tackle. They stole him over from South Beach and brought him over to Sin City, which is a good move for them. And then they also brought in the backup quarterback from the Colts, Gardner Minshew, to compete with Aiden O'Connell. More on that in a bit. And then in the draft, they got the best weapon available in the first round in tight end Brock Bowers from Georgia. I feel like that is a very good move for them. They could have went quarterback, but I guess there wasn't one available for them. And then they continued to try and help out the rest of the offense by getting another offensive lineman in Jackson Powers Johnson from Oregon. And then the rest of the way, it was a mix of both. They got corner Kamarian Richardson from Mississippi State to help out a secondary was kind of 50-50. Linebacker Tommy Eichenberg from Ohio State to help out a front seven that was really good last year. And then to try to beat the running back competition, running back Dylan Lobb from New Hampshire, and in corner Marlon Devonshire from Pittsburgh to, again, help out the secondary. So when you look at this Raiders offseason this past couple of months, I still kind of wonder what the plan is with the quarterback spot. Because on one hand, Aiden O'Connell was very decent last year, and he had some flashes as a rookie, despite the supporting cast, especially up front, was not that great. But at the same time, when he did have some time to throw the ball, time to make some plays, I just felt like something wasn't there, and it wasn't enough to fulfill the long-term starting role for Aiden O'Connell. But then on the other hand, when you look at how the offseason panned out for the Raiders and like the moves that they made, one can argue that they weren't aggressive enough. But then at the same time, it's just like, there wasn't really a lot that they could do, especially when the Falcons ended up taking Kirk Cousins. But then he also inexplicably took the best remaining quarterback away from them in Michael Penix Jr. Like a couple picks before them, like I think it was like 5 or 6 picks before them. So the Raiders, they kind of wisely went away with Kirk Cousins because Cousins was coming off an Achilles injury, but then there wasn't really much they could do, to be honest with you. So it was more of, well, we just got to take what we have with Aiden O'Connell and Gardner Minshew. So they also could have went with Bo Nix in day 2, but again, Denver took that early in the first round too. So honestly, I don't mind it necessarily with Gardner Minshew and Aiden O'Connell as stopgaps for this year, but I just hope that the Raiders and Mark Davis and Tom Telesco have a long-term plan next year. Now, unless Aiden O'Connell does somehow take a big step forward, but if he doesn't, then the Raiders got to reevaluate for 2025 at the game's most important position. However, on the opposite end of the spectrum, the offensive supporting cast should be much better, regardless whoever's at the quarterback spot, because this new Raiders regime, they had themselves a pretty good draft that helped out their quarterbacks, whether it was getting the best tight end in there with Brock Bowers or beefing up some weak spots in the offensive line. The quarterbacks, whether it's O'Connell or Minshew, they'll at least be able to make the most of it, despite their deficiencies, because they got some much needed help. Bowers joining Devontae Adams and Jacoby Myers, gonna make for a nice passing attack, just as long as the quarterback takes advantage of it. The offensive line starting to have plenty of potential with the likes of the people that are already there, like Andre James and Dylan Parham. And then you bring in a guy like you bring in a guy like offensive lineman Jackson Powers Jr. And you got yourself a pretty solid tandem in up front to protect your QB. So this group makes it one to watch. Again, it's just a little unfortunate with their quarterback situation. So looking at some of the Raiders' key games this season, you start out in Los Angeles to take on the Chargers and their new head coach, Jim Harbaugh. So kind of a test for both of these teams, but more especially the Raiders as they kick off the Antonio Pierce era fully. And then you go, and in a couple weeks later, you have your host home game against the Carolina Panthers and Bryce Young. That's kind of a little bit of a test there, but you don't really know what to expect with the Panthers team still in rebuilding. And then the big test for you comes a week later against a tough Browns defense. And, well, honestly, something that you don't really know what to expect with Deshaun Watson and that side of the ball. So if you're the Raiders, your goal for this season, yes, you have all these pieces, on defense, but some questions on offense. But nonetheless, you did pretty well for yourselves. You almost got to the point of earning a playoff berth, but we're just a little bit short. So your goal for this year should be to try and earn one, to try and earn a playoff berth, regardless of the deficiencies at the game's most important position. So speaking of which, who's going to be the starting quarterback for this team? Gardner Minshew, a solid backup that nearly guided the Colts into the playoffs last year, if not for that one drop, if not for that bad pass. But you also have Aiden O'Connell, who was decent last year, despite a very limited supporting cast, but now he has a much better one. They both have their flaws, but they do have some positives in them. And, well, someone has to take the starting role. And Antonio Pierce came out recently saying that someone's got to step up and take it. Someone's got to have that edge in them. And I think that edge could likely go to Gardner Minshew when it's all said and done come September. And then for Antonio Pierce, how's he going to fare in his first year as a full-time head coach? Because once Antonio Pierce took over from Josh McDaniels, the Raiders went from 4-5 to 5-4. That's like a reverse turnaround. And that include that 5-4 record, that 5-4 stretch, includes a 3-1 division record in the AFC West, and that one of those wins was a Christmas Day upset over Patrick Mahomes and the Chiefs. So that was their biggest highlight of the year. So yeah, teams are likely to catch on to Antonio Pierce now and how he coaches this team. But it'll be interesting how he adapts to games now that he has the Raiders under his full grasp. The Raiders, they had a promising finish to their 2023 season, and they still have an uneasy quarterback situation with who's going to start with between Minshew and Aiden O'Connell. But they actually figured to be in pretty solid shape this coming fall. They still have a strong supporting cast on the offensive side of the ball, and their defense is still very, very tough. It can be like an X factor in their games. They do have some tough opponents on their schedule because, well, it's a very tough AFC. But I figured they could be in the mix for a playoff berth as long as their defense keeps them in it. And whoever starts at quarterback, they just do their job.